Thursday in the City. This is a place at which we attempt to approach and address the large questions of our day, not necessarily to dispense the answers, but to think together on these very weighty matters. We've covered in years past, months past, we've covered such topics as big business and politics and immigration, human sexuality. This series of Thursdays in the City, we're looking at something that is weighing heavy on us all, either as individuals or as people connected to families, and that is the questions surrounding mental and emotional health, wellness, and mental illness. And so it is something that's extremely important for us to address and to think together about. So I would invite you to avail yourself of this opportunity to think of questions, to listen to these practitioners on our panel tonight, and to talk with each other as well, because in listening to each other, we will better be able to understand each other and understand that mental illness is a wide-ranging, and mental health in general is a wide-ranging domain that affects each person differently, and it affects people connected to that person in a wide variety of ways. And it is our hope also that we can begin to reduce the stigma of talking about mental health. And we can offer the reality to folks that we are not alone when we face mental health challenges. So welcome to Thursday in the City, everybody. We've got panelists here tonight that I do want you to know. Jessie Higgins is a licensed professional counselor and a licensed marriage and family therapist. And she and her husband, August, whom I met and called by another name tonight, moved to San Antonio 8 years ago. Jessie works at the Center for Healthcare Services, which is the county's mental health service. And by the way, that is, y'all have got your work cut out for you. I do know that. And also, she runs the Josephine Recovery Center, which is a 24-hour crisis respite program for adults. That is some work, people. That is some work. She and her husband attend Trinity Baptist Church, and they do have a not very nice cat. Now, that is not my own descriptor. That is Jessie's. And other people. Okay. So I'm not alone in using that descriptor, clearly. If the cat is watching, our apologies to you tonight. Now, our other panelist tonight is Blake Herrell. He's a second-year psychiatry resident, member of the U.S. Air Force. And he's based here in San Antonio. He graduated from University of North Texas Medical School in Fort Worth, and he's looking forward to the end of his residency. He's particularly interested in pursuing child and adolescent psychiatry, another cutting-edge domain that deserves our very full attention. So welcome, the two of you tonight. And can we welcome our panelists here tonight? Thank you for being here. As always, my co-host this evening is Megan Langen. She is Associate Minister for Single Adults here at First Baptist Church. Yes, you can applaud. And she is also a licensed Master of Social Work and keenly interested in matters of this import. So I'm just glad all of y'all are here. They're basically here to prop me up on this stage. So welcome and thank you. I do want to call your attention to the fact that we have a way for questions to come to us all during the program. If you think of a question, if you think of a question that you want to ask, again, stop paying attention to the panel discussion immediately, because these questions are going to be very, very important. They're extremely important. So stop paying attention to whatever's going on up here and go to sli.do, sli.do. I don't know why that's the way it is, but or you can go to slido.com, but just sli.do will get you there. The key word is THINC, T-H-I-N-C, T-H-I-N-C, and you can type in your question, it'll come to us. And if we have time, we may take questions from the floor as well, but we do need to, sometimes by the time it gets to the end, you've forgotten questions, so I would urge you to use Slido, and we can get all those questions in, or very nearly. So with that said, we're going to begin our panel discussion tonight here at Thursday in the City. And again, thank you for joining us. And by the way, we are going out on live stream tonight, and we will be doing that for the next two in this series as well. We've got next week, the 22nd, and the final one in this series is the 29th of April. And we will be live streaming if you can't make it. But we love having the in-person experience too. And it helps, I think it helps all of us really to gather and to think about this matter in person. But live streaming is also an option. So welcome to those on live stream. And this will be available soon. I don't know about the next day, probably not the next day. We're still working on last week's actually, but we will archive all these and they'll be available at fbcsa.org/think, and there's a link that'll take you to the YouTube channel where that will be available. So, yeah. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm glad y'all are here. We are going to go ahead and dive in. Yeah. Megan, help us to do that.
Yeah, so just to kick us off. So last week we talked about COVID exhaustion and mental well-being, and I think that was a good kind of opening to all of this that we're doing this month, because maybe some of us haven't thought through our own mental health, or we haven't thought through, maybe we've experienced anxiety or depression, but we've all experienced COVID, right? And so that was a good way to kind of engage in all of this. And so now that we've been thinking about this for a while, help us understand. We're going to be talking through mental health diagnoses, mental health challenges. Help us understand diagnosing when it comes to mental health. What's the utility of it? I know sometimes it's helpful or unhelpful. Could you just talk about, the utility of diagnosing and what we get from that?
Doctor.
Can y'all hear me? Is the mic on?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. I first have to say that what I say here represents my own opinions and not that of the United States Air Force or my residency program.
And it's void in Wisconsin, but I didn't know if we needed it.
But let's see. So I usually, when I approach mental health diagnoses and things like that, I find that people tend to relate to like medical diagnoses a little more than mental health diagnoses, and so I like to start there and then tie them together. But one common medical diagnosis is diabetes. I think most people are familiar with it based on commercials and things like that. And so, with diabetes, the diagnosis of this goes way back to ancient Egypt, and it's pretty interesting. But they actually would taste the urine of people, and it'd be sweet, and they'd be like, this is interesting. And they would link that with increased frequency, increased appetite, and a bunch of different things, and they would say, all these things seem to go together. And then over time, you started to see that they would link these symptoms, and then they'd try and find an explanation for, what is this? How do these all work together? And over time, our definition of diabetes has evolved, and we have this diagnosis, and it has these definitions. So similarly, a lot of times mental health seems kind of way out there, totally separated from medicine, but it's in its way unique, but there's also a lot of similarities throughout history, even with depression. There's descriptions back to like ancient Greece and things like that, where they would describe these depressive kind of patterns and syndromes. And they would say, look, we're seeing all of these specific things within this person who seems to be afflicted in some way and suffering and not doing that well. And over time, psychiatry has its own, and mental health has its own history. But with diagnosis, what we're looking at is not only like someone's thoughts and feelings and emotions, but also the social context in which they're in, how they're functioning within that context. Is their experience like a departure from their normal experience and their baseline? Like, has something changed, and are they suffering as a result from that? And so sometimes the utility of having a diagnosis and correlating a lot of the things that we're observing, it helps us to arrive at treatment options or understanding what to look for in the future, or how we could potentially intervene in this person's life to try to help them through that. And so that's one general way of how I like to think of diagnosis and how it can be helpful.
Sure. And now, Jesse, in hearing this, a counselor will also diagnose as well. So, hearing what Blake is saying, did you hear some things that are common to your experience of diagnosing? And then let's talk a little bit about the possible way that a diagnosis can just stick a label on somebody. So talk about your experience.
Yeah, so diagnosis, you use the word utility, and it's sort of practical, and it's sort of necessary. It feels scary because there has been this fear of the label. And I would say that what we're all trying to do, I think as professionals, but also literally right this minute in this room, is try and destigmatize those labels, where I would hope that when people find out a diagnosis, that they feel relief. I know I've had friends who are going to the hospital or the doctor all the time for these like medical issues, and they finally get into the right specialist, and they finally get okay, this is it. You need to do this, this, and this. This is your treatment. This is your, and they feel you want answers. And so I think that a diagnosis, if we have to, I mean, I don't know, as professionals, I don't know, secret insurance really wants you to use them.
Yeah.
So sorry about that.
Yeah.
But
There's that too.
Yeah. But I think if we can really bring these diagnoses sort of out into the light and look at what they mean, and that the label is something that's concerning, but only if we as a society keep buying into the fact, or to the idea that it's concerning.
Okay.
And so I think, but I talked to someone this week who's concerned about a diagnosis, a mental health diagnosis that their family member might have received, and so
Right,
it's
sure.
Yeah, it's complicated, but it does serve its purpose for giving the person information, but also
Yes.
giving the professionals information about what's going on.
Is that your experience as well, Blake, with the impact of a diagnosis?
Yeah, I definitely think, and it's not like across the board. Like for some people, it is freeing, and they're like, "That's what it is." Like I've wanted to know what this is and how to like conceptualize it. However, for some families, certain diagnoses have like different prognoses. So like looking forward, what is the likely pattern that you're going to experience? And so some diagnoses carry a little more weight in terms of like the future and what it looks like. And so hearing that diagnosis may be associated with some like pretty heavy feelings, similar to a diagnosis of like cancer and things like that.
Yeah.
People have in their mind what comes along with this. And so it's not across the board. Some people like the diagnosis and it helps them conceptualize it. Some people take an identity on with it, and that they can become that diagnosis. And then, so it's a big spectrum.
Jesse, along those lines, can you help us to look at this concept of pathologizing? And you know, I think that diagnoses are absolutely necessary as a categorizing tool to shed some light, even at 30,000 feet, on what's going on. I think it's in the misuse or the wrong-headed thinking about diagnoses that we can get into labeling people, of course. But through history, there have been, you know, we've had populations of people. Oh, those are the lepers, or those are the, you know, people with HIV, or, you know, whatever. And it tends to be dismissive or diminish somebody's value. Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it is hard living with this yourself, or living with people that you love who have a hard, you know, have a label. And like I said, I know I'm painting us with a rosy glow, but my hope is that we start to bring things out into the open, so that the stigma around someone who has schizophrenia or borderline personality disorder,
Yeah.
or, you know, depression, spells of depression, whatever you call it, is something that we understand, and that we see where it came from, and that we try and work with or have compassion for, much like the way that the stigma around, you know, the diseases that you've talked about, we've moved sort of away from.
We have.
From
I
that
mean,
stigma.
in our lifetimes, or very nearly, we've seen that kind of movement, and so I guess there is some hope there. And part of what you said, bringing it out into the open. I mean, if it stays cloistered among, you know, the professional class, then, you know, everybody just goes, oh, we have to sort of, you know, hear something coming from on high, you know, and then we say, oh, that person is a schizophrenic. Instead of, you know, that is a person who's living with somewhere on the, you know,
Yeah, person-centered language is really
Schizo-
important there, right? Yeah,
affective
we can
disorder.
say, yeah, this is
Yeah.
a schizophrenic, or this is a whatever, and there's so much more to that person beyond that
Right.
label. And the more we do that, the more, you know, pathologized they, you know, the more secluded they become.
Right.
But yeah.
Now, we've started. We raised the term, you know, schizophrenia already. But let's talk about some general categories here. For instance, mood disorders, and psychotic disorders and anxiety disorders. What are mood disorders?
So some common mood disorders that you may have heard of are like major depressive disorder or bipolar disorder. Those are some common ones, but essentially they're diagnoses that focus, kind of self-explanatory, like on that person's mood. And then within each kind of disorder or diagnosis, there's specific ways and patterns in which that mood is kind of on one end or the other. So there's like a depressive end of the spectrum, or a kind of commonly used term is like manic end of the spectrum. So mood disorders can kind of hang in different areas of the spectrum for certain periods of time and cause different impairments within people. If that,
Okay, yeah.
I don't know if that's helpful
Oh,
at
yeah,
all.
absolutely. I mean, I think we hear these terms, you know, often, and we say, well, that person has depression. Well, what does that really mean? You know, and you know, you talked about major depressive disorder or persistent depressive disorder, these kinds of things, or maybe it's just the person has come off of this manic phase and is in a, you know, hypomanic phase or something. But,
While we're talking about specific diagnoses, I think it's important for us to understand that all of us have these thoughts, feelings, emotions, and behaviors.
Thank you. Yeah, yeah.
And so we all will feel depressed or manic, and we all might be delusional sometimes.
Absolutely.
And we all, have these, and, some people are more lean towards one way or the other, but it really, and Blake talked about it a little bit earlier, when you get a diagnosis, it means it's impairing your daily life, and it's for a certain, duration of time. But I think it's important to build our own compassion and understanding of, yeah, all of us have, these sort of pressured states or excited states where we get a little hyper and we maybe make some decisions. I mean, if that's something that someone could be like, they're manic, they're in a manic state right now,
yeah, right,
and so
right.
I think it's important for us to realize that we all have times of being mentally unwell,
Yeah.
and maybe in mental illness, it sounds a little bit like it's a longer duration. But I think recognizing our own tendencies helps us to build compassion for those folks who just
Well said. Yeah.
experience them for more often or longer than some of the rest of us.
Yeah, it is, none of us are impervious to those kinds of things, and that's exactly right. And you also said something about impairment of daily life. That is a very important indicator that that there needs to be some kind of intervention, because I may feel really down, but I go to work, I have the ability to relate to my family and take care of my kids and this kind of thing. And so it's not depression, or it may not be a major depressive episode, or it may not be something of this nature, because it is not impairing my daily life. Is there more clarity that we need to shed on that?
Well, and I think with the impairment too, it's not always something that the person themselves recognizes as
Right.
they're going through it. And so with the impairment, it can look very different for plenty of different people, and even within like a major depressive episode, there's different severities of those things. And,
Sure.
And with different severities, there can be different interventions that are beneficial in those unique situations. And so I think that's why it's always important, if possible, to have people around you who can speak into your life too, and point those things out of, because sometimes if we're going through it, we might not realize that perhaps our performance at work isn't quite what it used to be, or things like that.
And that's a great point, Blake, because we're talking about isolation as a part of all of this, and in this whole series, part of the terrible plight of folks who suffer great distress with mental health challenges is that they are isolated, or they feel like nobody would understand. And you just said that it is so important to be surrounded with people who can speak to us. I just don't think we can hear enough about that.
I just wish there was some sort of health class curriculum, starting at a young age.
Yes. Yes,
That
that's
was like, you're going to not want to get out of bed sometimes and not shower for a week, and that's time for you to go get a checkup. Or, there's...
Why isn't there, Jesse? That is a
Yeah,
great point.
I don't know. The legislature's in session, so we'll write them a letter. But
Yeah, truly.
Because for a long time, I think people haven't had the luxury of being in their feelings. I'm gonna go on a tangent a little bit, but our modern society, where I don't get up and work a field, and I don't even have to cook my own food, really.
Yeah.
I can get my groceries delivered. And a lot of people say that kids these days have it so great. Whatever. I don't think it's bad. I just think there's a shift, and we are able to, as a society, as a world, we're sort of on a different hierarchy of needs plane than we were 100 years ago, or
Right.
maybe 50 years even. And so I think people are more emotionally intelligent and more in tuned, and watching the world around them, and that it's not always easy to digest sort of everything that's happening all at once.
And yet, a lot of times, people don't sit with their feelings very long, even if we are attuned. There's sort of a paradox going on, because I think that's exactly right. We
Too
talk
many
about
feelings,
feelings all
numbing
the
feelings.
You're right.
Too many feelings, numbing feelings.
Yeah, exactly. And the regulation of those feelings sometimes is not very well
Yeah.
practiced, or we don't know how, really. I mean, not to scold anybody, but we don't know how, which, brings up your class idea. I mean, churches need to be talking about this, which is what we're
They
trying to do
are.
here.
It's so
Yeah,
good.
right.
I was going to say, on the point of the class, if you have a particular interest in that, or if anyone watching has a particular interest, that's something that I've been thinking about pretty recently, and I have no idea where to start. But I think, how we always say, why didn't they teach me how to do my taxes in school? It's
Exactly.
That is-
Yes.
Well, I think this could be a very similar thing of why have we not talked a little more about
Okay.
this?
Yeah.
That is
So hit me up if anyone.
that is chill inducing. I mean, I feel it right now. Speaking of feelings,
Well,
chill
This
feelings.
is so good too, because this is a more clinical conversation. We're talking about what the fibers of mental health and mental illness really look like, but especially to your point, Blake, about the need for people around us to point these things out. Because when I've been in times of depression or anxiety, I'm not aware of it until, my husband or somebody else says, "Hey, I don't know about that. Are you doing okay?" And so hear us, anybody that's in the room or online, we don't want this conversation to be a textbook or sterile in any way. We want the end result of this month, and especially tonight, to be, if you're not in community, please get in community, because we want so badly to be able to be that for each other.
Absolutely.
And that's what we're doing this whole month for, is that hopefully by the end of this, our church and our community can do that for one another a little bit better.
Yeah.
And without as much awkwardness and bumbling, because I know it's hard to talk about mental health, but
That is absolutely
Just-
right. And speaking of that, you have some literature available back there, right?
Yes, I did. I did bring.
Do we have that on a slide?
They do. It's the COVID crisis counseling program.
Can you put that up? Is there anybody running this ship?
There we go.
Oh, okay, there we go. Okay.
Yeah. So
I'm sorry, that's not a diss. I didn't know who was back there.
you're doing great back there.
Yeah, you are
so-
doing great.
So I do work for the county's mental health agency, and we're state funded, and any other funding we can get. But one of the programs we've been tasked with is this COVID crisis counseling program. And it has a free program Monday through Friday at 8:30 to 5:30. It also has a crisis line on there, which I think is helpful for people to just have in their phone. But I'll tell you, since the snow, it's about 2 months exactly, I have had 4 different people call me and say, I have to go somewhere, I have to do something, I
my
need to
word,
get into professional help. And I don't know what it was about some terrible cherry on the top of an awful Sunday with that with our snow
exactly.
week.
Yes.
And I know y'all
yes.
talked about COVID last week, but I think people are aching more than ever, and I just hope that how bad we've all sort of felt, or we've witnessed people feel really bad. I hope it changes our society and helps us to destigmatize mental health problems. I think everyone's in a lesser state than we were a year and a half ago, and I hope that it helps us to find the true compassion and empathy, but also just the value in, taking care of ourselves. And that sounds like we could do something. I feel like that was the problem with the snow. It was the year of not being able to do anything with the week of really not being able to do anything to help ourselves or people around us or whatever.
That's a perfect description, and it just broke people, I think. I mean, it really did cave in on them.
Yeah.
That is tremendous.
We also have flyers in the back.
Yeah,
For
so
anybody that wants.
Please
bring that
pick
home.
those up, and we've got flyers for the Ecumenical Center as well. And if we can we put up the other slide too on, yes, there's the website. And how old is the Center for Healthcare? How long has that been around?
Just over 50 years.
Okay,
Yeah.
wow. We can't trumpet that enough. Is there another slide for the Ecumenical Center Counseling Extension here at First Baptist? Do we have that? Yeah. So you can call that number as well. But you can avail yourself of this help. And we need to get the word out about these things. Thanks. Thanks, y'all.
Yeah.
And if we can put the Slido slide back up there, that would be great. Thank you. Thank you. Y'all are, why would I ever say, is there anybody driving this ship? I'm so sorry. I really feel like a heel. Sorry about that. Okay, thumbs up. Okay, great. We're back on good terms. So that's good.
So we got through mood disorders, and we'll go through some of the more specific and more common ones in a second.
Yeah.
But psychotic disorders, would y'all help us kind of generally understand?
And this
what
is
those
very
are?
scary sounding, but I mean, just what are we talking about when we talk about psychotic disorders?
So psychotic disorders are marked by psychosis, which psychosis just means anything that's you're sort of seeing or hearing or thinking that's not rooted in the reality that other people see, hear, or think. And so they do carry some of the weightier things. Schizophrenia is a psychotic disorder. But one of the coolest things is there's amazing research and programming around what's called first episode psychosis. And if we're able to, we as the medical community is able to catch psychotic breaks in their first or second break, the prognosis for people is light years ahead.
Wow.
Because it's literally has to do with brain functioning, and if we're able to help the brain correct itself earlier, we can really help that person, and then their prognosis is much better. Psychotic disorders are hard.
Is this is very interesting research, and Blake, is this because of the way that pathways are created in the brain, and if you get there early, you can remap that, or how does that work? I don't know. I'm using this language that I don't even know.
No, you're good. Yes.
What is the brain? No. I mean,
Well,
go ahead. If I only had one, me and the scarecrow. Okay.
So I think essentially the general thought is the longer your brain stays in this pattern of not functioning correctly, the more likely it is to continue in that trajectory and continue to deteriorate in a sense. To where it makes it much harder to return back to a more like normal.
So the
level of
function is
functioning.
degraded to the at least as concerns ordered thinking. I mean, it just falls into this disarray.
Mm-hmm.
This sort of behavioral pattern is also helped. This happened to you once, you got into the right level of treatment, which is varied. It is talk therapy, it is medications, it is diet. And then if that happens again, you're able to still access those mechanisms of getting better instead of starting this pattern when you're already pretty far in or really struggling. So it's like,
Makes a lot of sense.
to use your sort of diabetic metaphor, which is one that I use all the time, or analogy, is one that I use all the time. Okay, well, I'm borderline diabetic, so I watch what I eat, versus I am a very fragile diabetic.
Yeah.
I'm doing insulin all the time. It's really past managing it with diet.
So you get to a brittle schizophrenic stage, sort of, following that kind of metaphor, rather than stopping it early on and supplying the person with this pathway of resources, I guess, internal and external resources.
And part of that is the support system that they develop, like not only with medical care, but ideally like family and friends and support too.
Yeah.
And it's not to say that it stops everything in its tracks. Like
Sure,
they're
sure.
there are ups and downs for sure, but just overall, comparatively, like how you would do with the early intervention versus how one would do without. It's
And would this apply across psychotic disorders, like not only schizophrenia, but other types of psychotic disorders as well? Or all along the spectrum of?
I think that's safe to say, and
Okay.
and like the same, like with a mood disorder, like bipolar disorder, it's a very similar thing. An example would be like if someone had the diagnosis of bipolar disorder, and they know that sleep deprivation is gonna make them more likely to go into a manic state, and with a manic state, a lot can come with that. But if early on they're involved with treatment, they know that, hey, these things are helpful, these things are unhelpful, and they can implement those things, that can just be like
Yeah.
Okay.
instrumental to their recovery.
Let's talk, or did you have anything?
Oh, no,
there?
yeah.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about anxiety disorders too.
Yeah.
This is,
That feels more approachable, but there's a lot under that umbrella.
that's absolutely right,
Yeah.
yeah.
Would you, break down kind of what is under that umbrella for us?
Yeah,
There's a lot under anxiety disorders. Generalized anxiety is probably a common one that's talked about. Social anxiety is another one. Panic disorder falls within that. There's specific phobias as well that fall under anxiety disorders. What else?
and a
would you-
lot of wider culture, or at least in decades past, the exposure to that has been sort of comedic, like I've got claustrophobia, or this person over here has agoraphobia, Monk, we all kind of laughed along at him, and I love that series, but it is, I wonder sometimes, is this creating this sort of thing like that happens to somebody else, and that's just a
Or it's a bit,
weirdo?
yeah.
I mean,
And, go ahead.
It's a bit, but also anxiety is so, I don't know, we're normalizing it to a point where I'm like, y'all don't have to live this way. I see.
okay, say more about
I
that.
see on social media, I see people just talking about being anxious all the time, and I actually think that while COVID has made people, including myself, much more anxious in different ways, it's also removed a lot of my busyness, and I hope it's another thing that we're able to put aside, is that sort of like being busy is a badge of honor. I think sometimes people, almost feel like they have to be anxious. That's just who I am. I'm just anxious, instead of
Yeah.
sort of trying to find ways to work through it. I think, and I'm not trying to minimize
Yeah,
it at
and
all,
what-
but I think our
can-
culture is like,
What is that? Is it has that become a badge of honor too? I mean, what are we
I don't
talking
know.
about there?
With teenagers and stuff, do you hear them talking about their anxieties and?
In some ways, yeah. I think, like you brought up culture, like I think all these things tie together of like the stigmatization and culture. And so like even within our Western culture, like on this topic specifically, I think we focus so much on like, how much do I work? And almost if I'm like, I work this many hours a week,
Yeah,
you're
you're right.
like,
Yeah.
whoa. So like we have this huge emphasis we place on like productivity and how we're doing things on time, what we're doing.
Yeah.
And that's a cultural thing. And then also within our culture, we have different cultures. Like there's like certain like faith-based cultures too around certain things,
Sure.
But I think those all can influence how we perceive mental health overall as well. But yeah, definitely, it's interesting if you look at like the individualistic themes of our culture and certain other things that are not necessarily solely unique to our culture, but how they influence our behavior and overall thoughts and
Yeah.
functioning.
Yeah. Well, and I'm sure the Western approach to treatment for those things is also limited too, right? And we might not even know the worlds that extend beyond our culture for
Right,
treatment of those
exactly.
things. But yeah,
And I think that is, I think we may we're going to talk a little bit about that later, because that's a huge topic, the whole idea of approaching something, from our Western perspective, and we talk about, cultural competencies and all that, which we've got to have. But I do want to stick with this anxiety disorder topic just a little bit longer, because there's also something called Obsessive-Compulsive Disorder. And can you talk about your experience with addressing that, or?
It's interesting. It used to be under the heading of anxiety disorders, but they actually moved it to its own, like obsessive and compulsive related disorders.
Okay.
I
Great.
know, interesting.
Thank you for that, because I was unaware. I need to study that.
Yeah, but I think, so with OCD, like, it's a very common thing to say, oh, that's my OCD.
Yeah, and that's what I was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you hear that all the time, and it almost sort of trivializes that or makes it this throwaway line.
Yeah.
I think it does trivialize it. I don't want to deny that, but then we can also recognize, if this is how I feel when the ceiling tiles don't line up in the place I'm looking at.
Right.
How does someone feel who is really struggling with that? And it is important to understand OCD is both like having, a lot of times people have compulsive thoughts that that can be disturbing.
Yeah.
And it's hard to work with someone to try and convince them that your brain is somewhat playing a trick on you, and you recognize that these thoughts are not, that's not your real self.
Yeah.
And so it can be really challenging to actually walk through life with someone who has OCD. And so I would, same with like saying, oh, I'm so ADD, or, things like that. When you have those thoughts, you're probably in that space at that moment.
Yeah,
but how much
it is
worse
kind of a
is it?
spectrum,
Yeah.
isn't it? But if you don't get stuck there, that's, you just sort of move through that. But some people do get stuck, and they just dig down into that. Help us understand this a little bit more. These obsessive thoughts come, and then the compulsive behaviors will follow that in order to get some relief from the compulsive thoughts. Is that generally how that works?
Yeah, definitely. And
So the behavior, like, I've got to wash my hands 100 times, or I've got to check the lock so many times, or whatever, very obvious. There are also less obvious obsessive-compulsive behaviors or compulsions. But these obsessive thoughts drive that. Is that right? And the behaviors are in response to that in order to relieve the distress from those obsessive thoughts.
absolutely. And I think just to paint a picture of, if you're noticing these patterns and like you feel compelled to do these things and it's concerning to you and you want to talk to someone about it, by all means, I would say talk to someone about it. But to paint a picture of it, like, you might have these routines that you do and be very like adamant about those, and it kind of
Sure.
bothers you when those are off. But just to paint the kind of more extreme sides of the spectrum, it could be so impairing to where someone doesn't leave their house for like 7 hours, or they can't make it to the restroom in time because these compulsions are so rooted, and it can like, each person's. We talked about like, how does it affect your daily life or cause impairment?
Yeah.
It looks different for each person, but it can be like severely impairing. And so just to paint an idea of like the spectrum of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of suffering there.
Yeah.
These, we're going to go to personality disorders in a second, but all of like anxiety disorders can then lead to depressive episodes as well. Is that right? Because how does that work?
Yeah, I did think I wanted to add in post-traumatic stress disorder is under the heading of anxiety disorders, right?
I think they made it its own.
They
like,
made it,
Yeah,
they carved it out.
But yeah,
I guess they did, and
Yeah.
I
The
didn't
DSM
even
is
realize
fluid.
that for,
Yeah.
it's like trauma and
Right.
stressor-related
Uh,
disorder.
Yeah.
Right, and so
Wow.
I wanted to bring up the idea of trauma, and I was in one of my past jobs, I worked a lot with medics and doctors, and when they talk about trauma, they're talking about like head trauma and burn trauma and things like that, level 1 trauma centers and things like that. But in mental health, when we talk about trauma, we're talking about something negative that happened that still causes you pain or
As if it's
distress.
happening right now,
Well,
or very
yeah,
close to
or
right
ruminating and all
Yeah.
these things. And so I think it's important, especially with all of the disorders we're talking about. We are as a medical field moving more towards understanding people are lots of things, and genetically and their who raised them and their experiences and all of those things sort of hit people and send them different ways.
Yeah.
And I think that, it's helpful to understand some of these things. They are genetic, they are biological, they're in you. But a lot of them are brought out or enhanced by, or some of them caused by things that have happened to you. And so really understanding that and exploring that with people, I think is important. And so when you talk about this interconnectedness of anxiety and depression, a lot of times your depression makes you act a certain way where you're removed, you're isolated, you don't want to do things. Depression is about not doing things.
Yeah.
Or not feeling. It's not necessarily sadness, it can be the absence of feeling. But your
I'm glad you
family
said
and
that, too. That's
your
important.
family and friends are pushing you to do things.
Yeah.
Come on, go to the baby shower with me. Let's go. You're supposed to be at work, like these things. And so your depression can, put you in a state where you're going to get anxiety when these people are, or
yeah.
society, or your bills, are pressuring you to do things that you don't feel like you're able to do at this moment. And so, and I don't know if you want to talk about how anxiety leads you to depression, because it's the chicken
Because
or
it
the
works
egg.
both ways
Yeah.
then.
Yeah. Well, and that's important
Okay.
to remember. These aren't,
Interesting.
they don't happen in a vacuum, right? And these are pretty fluid things.
I hadn't
that-
thought about the
Yeah.
fact that depression can feed back
Yeah.
onto, it can be a feedback loop causing anxiety too,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, and there's, so we call it comorbidities or comorbid diagnosis, like occurring at the same time and causing some morbidity or just impairment in that person's life. But
Yeah.
that's very common across mental health in general, is you don't fit into one bubble. Like there's a lot going on, it's very complex. But with anxiety, let's just say, you have anxiety, it's got you like ramped up all the time, just processing everything, totally overwhelmed. Eventually that'll lead to exhaustion, and you'll be very tired. You'll want to withdraw, and in those times, to simplify it, that can kind of lead to some of these things with depression,
Okay.
feeling burnt out, feeling numb, and withdrawing from that. So they can play
Boy,
together.
that is a great picture from both sides of that. Now, and that really brought something out in my mind here, and that is anxiety itself. We're acting as though everybody understands what that is, and we may, but it is can you talk about how you define anxiety, Jesse?
I would say it's personal. It's different for every person, but yeah, it's a nervousness, it's a feeling in your chest or in your stomach. Medically, it's elevated heart rate and maybe perspiration, or I'm sure there's a lot more that you can talk about, but it's the feeling of dread, it's the feeling of I can't, it's all of those.
Yeah, and like muscle tension, irritability, like a bunch of other things. And since there's a lot of different diagnoses within the category of anxiety, kind of each one has its own specifier, but in terms of general like description of anxiety, that's usually
Yeah. dread, you said dread, yeah,
But,
that's.
but dread
wow.
sort of all the time
All the time,
when
yeah.
we don't need to have dread, you know?
Right,
Like,
right,
yeah.
right.
Like more
Thinking
days,
about the
more days
thing,
than
yeah.
not, most.
And if it's
Yeah.
not, and the difference, I guess, between that and a phobia is that a phobia is focused on a certain specific thing, heights or, something of that nature, water. But this anxiety is just sort of amorphous. It doesn't have a shape to it, really. It's just dread.
Yeah.
And all these other things that y'all mentioned. And personality disorders,
yeah.
briefly, I don't know that we can be brief on that. But these are more ingrained. Can you shed
Yeah.
some light on that?
So, in a sense, I wrote something down about it so that I could say it specifically. Their personality disorders seem to be like value judgments regarding eccentricities, peculiarities, or extremes in behavior of an individual when they're compared with culturally predominant norms. And so it is something to understand is like it does occur within a culture, within a societal context, but typically these personality disorders will focus on kind of impairment, like we focused on with all these things, but also typically like extremes of behavior that aren't within.
It's really, and I like that you just named it, and I don't know how we need to be better, but it is value judgments, and it is totally culturally and contextually based, but it's part of it is doesn't get along with others the way other people get along with others, which that's hard. That's not easy, and they're oftentimes hard diagnoses to receive and to understand. But I think with a gifted practitioner, they can can walk people through them and understand and help them to see the areas in their life where maybe they aren't getting along as well as they would like to in different areas.
And can you help me understand the value judgments term as you're using it?
No, I just used it. I think when I say it, it's more just in terms of like what that culture values as like normal. Like
Oh, I see.
That's what we're
Okay.
saying. It's like
We're trying not to say
So
the
if the
normal
culture
word.
values humility and somebody is self-aggrandizing all the time, we would say that person has a narcissistic personality disorder.
potentially.
Yeah.
Maybe. I mean, I guess that's.
But to echo what she was saying, with personality disorders specifically, even though they can be some of the hardest to receive, I've seen some individuals find so much relief from it because they're like, wow, you just described my whole life and why I don't relate to people well.
Yeah.
And then we can talk about how did that come to be? Like, what happened in your life to bring you to this point?
Yes.
Like, it's very complex, but it can be very freeing for people to process through it in that way.
And I think
That's
it's
great.
important what you said, that it does involve a person who will unconditionally walk with them through sort of the difficulties. We are learning more and more about how trauma and the things that have happened shape people, and it's really sort of easy to be like, you were in a car accident, and now every time someone slams on a brake in a car, you have flashbacks and triggers and nightmares,
Yeah.
and now you don't want to get in cars. Okay, we got that. We very much
Right.
understand this linear relationship. But a gifted therapist can really help folks walk through, maybe smaller instances.
That is always just so hopeful to hear. That it's just
Well,
not.
I am a
it doesn't-
therapist, and
it
we're
do-
trying to stay in business.
Yeah,
But yeah,
well, and
yes.
you've got my business. Just keep talking. I just had to interject that. So
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of times people don't know what is therapy, what is counseling, what are we doing, what am I going to do every time I go in here? And the good thing is it should be different for every person, but yeah, it's if someone's been diagnosed, we'll talk about narcissistic personality disorder, but if someone's been diagnosed with that and they probably maybe don't think that they have it.
Right,
But
and they don't want to hear from you.
Right, but
Yeah.
a therapist is able to talk with them about experiences in their life that maybe didn't go like they thought they would, or relationships that haven't worked out. While also, if things are happening in the moment, being able to bring up, the way you just said that right then might have been hard for someone else to receive, things like that.
Yeah.
So, I think, yeah, it's hard to, if you've never
That's
been a
good.
part of the therapeutic process, it's hard to explain it sometimes.
You've got, we did mention narcissistic personality, but there's also obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, which are these more ingrained kind of ways of navigating the world that are not necessarily the obsessive-compulsive disorder itself, but more personality-based. And then borderline personality disorder is one in which I guess, I mean, again, all of these are, doesn't interact with others as well as others do. And so, but let's keep going.
Well, and this was helpful to break down anxiety, because we talked a little bit about this last week too, the feeling that our body gets when we experience anxiety, and oh, my neck is really tight, oh, it's been like that for a week, and kind of recognizing those things. Could you do the same thing for depression, just kind of break down what that looks like in everyday life?
Yeah, so most mental health issues have something to do with sleep, either too much or too little, or interrupted, or nightmares, or things like that. So depression can be marked by either insomnia or oversleeping. It can be marked by lack of eating or overeating.
That's important too. Yeah,
Yeah.
it can look really different. for-
Yeah, it can be, it's generally withdrawing and isolative, and it can be marked by like sadness and tearfulness, but it can also be marked by lack of emotion and lack of we talk about like a flat affect, but someone whose face is just not giving you what you would expect when you're talking to them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And for like major depressive disorder, one of the criteria that has to be met, there's either a depressed mood or decreased like joy and enjoyment within that. And so that kind of talks to both of those.
Like things that you used to take pleasure in and
Right.
you
And
don't anymore.
yeah, kind of the emphasis on not only the impairment it's causing in your life that we talked about, but also this departure from your baseline.
Okay. Oh, that's good. Okay, departure from what would normally have characterized you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and that's important too, because everyone's baseline is different, right? Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
So
But
if someone's
that gives us-
naturally,
That really does give us a graspable handle there,
Yeah.
somebody who departs from who they normally are.
because if someone's an introvert, that doesn't necessarily mean they're, secluding themselves in a
Right.
depressed state, but that does mean
Right.
their baseline is different from somebody that's,
Yeah.
yeah.
And kind of how we were talking about how early you catch this, this could have been this person's baseline for like years,
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And so that can be trickier to
Oh, okay, I see.
tease out.
Yeah.
But having that conversation with them, you might find, oh, prior to 2 years ago, I wasn't like this. And it's like,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that's really helpful.
Yeah, and I know we're kind of running a little bit out of time. We know we've got to get to Q&A too, but when we're, and we can cover more of this in Q&A, but when you have someone come to you, whether it's a client or a patient, and they're saying, okay, whatever they're presenting with, whether that's depression or a personality disorder or those things, what is your first approach for treatment and helping them just find hope in that initial visit? What is your first approach to those things?
So approach to treatment or approach to understanding what's going on?
Treatment. Well, I guess both.
Is it like, what can the person
Both and.
expect?
Yeah. I guess, what is the first step towards healing in that relationship, that clinical relationship there?
So we're in different sides of important parts of treatment, I think.
Same team.
Yeah, same team. I don't know
It's
sports.
important
I was
to
going to try and
note,
make
yeah.
a sports metaphor,
The
but I
same
don't
team.
know.
Sports.
We play different roles on the same theater stage. And so Yeah, so I think for therapy, the biggest thing is just applauding and sincerely applauding that people showed up and they came. They found you on the website or the insurance or the friend's recommendation, and they called and you did the screening and they came and they filled the paperwork
it's-
and all
yeah,
these things of like,
There's
what
several
is
points
my-
where you can turn back.
what does my
Yeah.
mom's pregnancy history have to do with my
Yeah.
therapy today? So I think that's a huge part is just really validating that people showed up and really just listening and just as much as you can. I love the keep going. What else? What else is going on? And then starting to figure out that person's own goals. I may think, oh, this is the best way to get you to this place, and that's not the place they want to go to, And so, and then just regularly checking in with them and figuring out where are we at with what you've been working on and what we've been talking about here, what has happened. Those are kind of the ongoing. But the first step I really think is just thanking people and being sincere about you got here and that was hard, and what do you want out of this?
Yeah.
What does that person want?
Yeah. Blake, what does that look like going to a psychiatrist for this thing?
What I aim to do with my approach is I usually like to establish how did we arrive here at this point? Like, what brought us to this point? Did you make this appointment? Did someone make this appointment for you? Do you even want to be here? Because that's huge to understand. But as we go forward, each person has their own process of how am I going to screen for certain things and kind of cast a broad net and try and figure out how I can best help. But once you start to arrive towards, what can we do? With psychiatry, we do specialize in the understanding of medications and how they can help people. Psychiatrists do go through medical school, and I was on a surgical rotation, and I was like, I don't like surgery.
Ew.
That's how you got here.
And here I am. My wife is a surgeon.
Yeah, there you go. Okay.
But
You got it all covered there.
So we have a biological understanding of the body, how medications play a role in that. But within our training, we also get exposure to therapy and then other aspects of the team. And so there are some psychiatrists who will take on more therapy as their practice, but as like a broad stroke, typically psychiatry would be focused on medications. And I want to say, I'm not hoping to give you a medication just for the sake of giving you a medication, right? I will, if based on our training and what we know and understand about medications, if it would provide some support and some stability in your life, or if there's something going on for which a medication is crucial, I will recommend that, but that's obviously up to the person to do that. But it's also important for us to understand when our medication's not the answer, and that's when, hey, I think you do great with therapy. Let me talk to you about therapy.
Because, now, Blake, let me just interrupt you there for a second. We are, and we are going to talk next week about the interplay of medication and therapy and faith. So you can come back, but
Please do.
but what isn't it or is it true that medication, it has a place, but it is a symptom addresser more than an underlying cause addresser? And so in your practice, you see both sides of that, right? Or help us to understand.
Yes, and so it's a very interesting topic. But for certain conditions, the medication is more likely to target the symptoms. There are some conditions in which they're more neurobiologically understood to where
Okay.
A medication is probably going to be one of the most beneficial things that you experience.
Because it is rooted perhaps sometimes in an actual physiological or biological
chemical.
cause.
And so,
Yeah.
and so when you say
Neurological.
that, like, it is rooted in an actual, then it comes with that, like, the potential implication of some of these others aren't rooted in physiology. And so it kind of goes to what you had talked about of, like, genetics.
Yeah,
So-
it's like how, you don't know how,
Yeah.
we don't always know exactly how to treat
Mm.
everything. I mean, there's, I think hand in hand, and having a therapist that has a good, if you also have a psychiatrist, has a good, working relationship with each other is helpful. But yeah, there's no, that's just the fun part of
Yeah, I guess
of the
so.
brain
I guess
and the
so.
human
Yeah.
experience.
To paint a picture, it's like the DSM is helpful
The
in
Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, it's
Yes.
sort of like the diagnosis guide, if you will, I guess. Okay.
it is helpful in understanding these disorders, what characterizes them, and how to apply them. But there's other areas within, so just like other fields of medicine, people are trying to, so you've heard of like MRIs and stuff like that. They're doing functional MRIs where they're looking at different areas of the brain and how they function, trying to map pathways and see how much of this is physiologic, how much of this is, genetic, how much is from their environment,
Yeah.
how much is from their development in childhood. Like, it's a very complex network of things, and that's where we're heading as a
Yeah, we're getting better.
yeah.
Well, I
Yeah.
think so.
Yeah, we're
Have
doing
hope.
it.
And practitioners like you really work at the frontier of that nexus of body and soul, I mean, and it is, thank you for doing that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really important,
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
and you're working so hard to
Yeah.
get there.
So psychology and psychiatry, like the psyche, I think, go Google it or something, but it has something to do with like soul.
It is. It's
Yeah.
Yeah.
psyche. It would be the Greek for soul, and so
Yeah.
that's exactly
Right.
what that comes
Right.
from.
And I know that I for sure am working my best to not separate the mind from the body. And I think that we have a lot more to learn about it, but there is a lot of exciting research. I don't know, I guess I think we're going to learn even more and help people even
Yeah.
Yeah.
better, even more precisely.
Yeah.
Well, to think that as you say, getting better. This is, it's just such good news for people that are suffering.
Yeah.
It's such good news, and for the families that are connected to those folks.
Yeah.
We had a panelist last week that did say that he always thinks in terms of the unitary existence of mind and body. He doesn't really make a differentiation. He is a psychotherapist, and he is like a registered somatic therapist as well, and so he thinks in those terms all the time.
Yeah.
Well, and as you're talking about this, I think this can go back to the diagnosis, right? Like, this person is not just this diagnosis. This
Yeah.
person is their whole genetic
Yes,
makeup and what
yes.
makes them up, their thoughts, feelings, emotions, their history, their beliefs, all this stuff like that. And then when you even bring faith into it, like
Oh, man. Yeah.
viewing someone from that perspective as a holistic person and all the things that cause them to be that person, I think it's so important, especially
Oh.
with mental health too.
Yeah.
All the things that cause them to be that person. And by the way, as you know, and just listening to the both of you, it's quite obvious that you see a person.
Yeah.
When you see a person, you don't see somebody that there's something wrong with them, or they're just flawed as a person. That's just not true. And they're suffering.
Yeah.
And this is just amazing. We're
Yeah.
going to go ahead and
Yeah.
get into some questions here. Some questions. Some of these are, somebody's playing a joke here. But anyway, I think I see a question from Richard Lombardini.
I was
But
gonna
anyway.
say, I think we know who
Is it about my mean cat?
Not yet. There may be one in there like that. These are all anonymous, but some of them are not so anonymous. Okay. Can a bipolar diagnosis be hereditary and passed from parent to child, or is it something diagnosed as a person gets older?
Most diagnoses happen in their late teens, early 20s. They can go later into the 30s, but most of them are happening earlier. There are indications that bipolar disorder can be genetic. It's not always. I mean,
but they look at like heritability, and when we say heritability, it's like how much did genetics play into this person and what they're experiencing, but it's pretty substantial. What was it, like height? Like we all accept like, oh, I'm this tall because of my parents and stuff like that.
Right.
The heritability of that, I think, at least quoted from what I read, was like 79%. For some studies with bipolar disorder, the heritability of it was ranged anywhere from like 50 to 65 or higher percent.
So
I had no idea.
Almost like that physical trait that
Wow.
you mentioned of height. That's very interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
What are good rules to follow when trying to help people see that they are becoming depressed, anxious, etc.? How do we approach that?
Being a good
someone
support
close
system.
to us?
yeah, good rules to follow you should always be rooted in compassion. And what I mean is saying, I'm worried about you. You used to do this, and this, and I'm just seeing, like, have you been feeling different? But I think it's important to sort of start from a place of reassuring the person that you're concerned and you love them, and that's why you're bringing this up, and then ask a lot of questions. I mean, have you thought of, do you have less energy? You seem to be not talking to me as often, or, have you noticed any changes? I think questions can be, not interrogations, it's hard sometimes,
Yeah,
but
right. Curiosity.
yeah,
more than
curiosity. And then saying, I love the I'm noticing and I'm wondering sort of questions. I'm wondering if you're feeling.
Those are good phrases, I guess, to keep in
and that's
mind.
I-centered language too, right?
Noticing,
You're
I'm
off.
wondering. Yeah. You're
it's-
off your game.
Yeah.
What's the
I've
matter
been
with
feeling that you.
What's
yeah.
the matter with you? That's probably.
Yeah, probably not
That's
as effective.
Yeah.
And it's important. So, like, love your neighbor as yourself. Like, very important. So asking yourself, am I loving this person by pushing into this? And so, in that concept, right? Loving someone may be very direct in that moment, and you have to be a little more direct. Or loving someone may be coming alongside them and trying to really understand, not curiosity for curiosity's sake, but curiosity for the sake of loving that person. Trying to understand, where are you at? Like, what is your experience right now? And then, instead of wrestling with that person in that moment, sometimes if you're able to understand where they're at, you're able to help align with their perspective, I guess, and help them to seek that treatment or get that treatment.
Yeah,
And something too,
that's great.
when we were in the School of Social Work, I felt like drilled all the time on, this is how you do a suicide assessment, right? And because those questions are so awkward and hard to ask, right? But they're so important to ask. And that's part of that too. And maybe they're not all the way down to that severity of symptoms and things, but being willing to ask the questions, I think, is so important, right? Because they might be kind of waiting for somebody to be willing to do that. And so even if it's awkward or uncomfortable, just being willing to ask the question.
Well, and all the research says that asking the questions is much, much better and better for the person than not asking the questions.
Yeah.
It's so important to remember. Absolutely. That gives us permission to do that.
Yeah.
And back to the thing we were talking about with depression initially, and like that person may not be recognizing that they're having some impairment or change in their functioning.
Oh, yeah.
Like, if you're comfortable doing that and recognizing those things, if you're looking out and trying to love other people and seeing those things, being comfortable with those questions, even from a not just suicide standpoint,
Yeah.
but also depression
Yeah.
standpoint. And all these things are
Yeah.
so important.
Here's another question. Outside of societal stigma, what are some of the biggest obstacles in accessing mental health care?
Cost. I mean,
Cost,
yeah,
okay.
mental health care, costs money. Therapy costs money, prescriptions cost money, doctor's visits cost money. Missing work to do all of these things costs money. It's
Combined with an insurance system that may not always have good mental health care coverage?
Sure. I mean, if you want to go to a therapist every week and you have insurance, great. That's going to cut down on your cost, but it's still going to cost more than a normal routine doctor visit. And so you're still, literally weighing the cost of like, this is an hour that I have to leave work, find childcare, figure out when I can go, and then I also have to pay. I mean, cost, I think, is a huge, I'm not going to try and act like it's not one of the biggest deterrents. It is.
And availability, like people who are able to provide those services. I honestly don't have numbers off the top of my head, but I think that's a huge barrier, especially like to give an example, child psychiatry, like the availability and wait list for child psychiatrists and things like that are like huge.
Yeah.
And so if you're
I would imagine
listening
so.
and you have a desire to, like, for a passion for mental health, and you want to pursue something to where you can help others in that, like, go for it.
I once asked a psychiatrist friend of mine why, and she was talking about the special type of person who's a doctor, but also in this field of, enjoying delving into people's psyche. It's a special type of person, and yeah, there's a huge, in our community as well, there is a huge lack of psychiatrists specifically. It is hard.
Culturally, communities of color sometimes are and even communities who are, Anglo communities, white communities too, they all have different reasons for reticence to access health care. Sometimes in communities of color, those communities don't often interact with healthcare providers on a regular basis anyway, and when you come to some kind of specialized area like healthcare, that may even be less, there may even be less interaction there too, I think. And I think...
Well, there's access issues, there's representation issues.
Right.
It'd be really hard for a peer of mine who's Black to come in and talk to me about how affected she's been by all of the racial-oriented violence, even just in the past week.
Yeah.
I can understand this person, not wanting to come and talk to me about that.
Yeah.
And so there's access issues. There's availability within the community, like how close you can find someone within your zip code or wherever you want to go see someone. And then we can't just talk about communities of color without talking about disparities of income across different communities of color. And so again,
Cost again.
And that's unfortunate. And I hope that's strides that we're making. But yeah, mental health care is seen as a luxury sometimes by groups and by all different groups, and
That's a great point, yeah.
And so I'm really applauding the strides that you guys are making here as a downtown church and having counseling available to the community. I mean, this is an area where we need counselors.
We could have 100 of these kinds of meetings and 100 more churches, offering on-site counseling, whatever, and we would still be underserved as a society. I mean, there's that much of a dearth of care, and partially it is because the conversations aren't happening and among families and friends and so forth. And maybe that's changing with this pandemic and so forth. Hope so.
And looking at this, like, it's not just, helping is not just by going into, like, this front line of, like, doing therapy or prescribing medications and stuff. Like, if you have a passion for this and you're great with insurance and you can restructure stuff or legislature,
point,
like,
Blake,
do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're gonna have to raise the hood and work on the whole engine, the different components of that.
I will tell you, in the legislature right now, they're considering a bill that will expand telehealth access for therapy. It's something that was a COVID exception, that insurances would pay for telehealth or reimburse for telehealth. And so, of course, we can understand how not having to drive to a session, not only does it remove some stigma of, like, your car is parked outside the center for therapy for people who don't think they're good parents, or whatever.
Right, exactly.
And you're able to access that where in wherever you are, literally on your lunch break, things like that. And so there is some strides being made to broaden the access.
Yeah. I'm thinking that therapy center probably needs to think about a new name.
Well, before we move on from that, I just want to, we were talking about the lack of equity for different ethnic groups when it comes to therapy. And
Yes.
there is a huge gap there, but there are a few organizations, especially for anyone that's listening to this, even if it's years later. The Loveland Foundation is one, and Therapy for Black Girls is one. There's several organizations that are working to address that gap, and so I don't want to brush over that without, please hear me, there is a deep inequity there, but there are things
but they're
for you. If you're hearing this and you need, especially healing from racial trauma or other things, there are things for you, and so reach out to us.
the
Loveland Foundation. It's a specific funding group to be able to connect more people of color to therapy. And then Therapy for Black Girls is another one. But that's only two that I just have seen. But there's
That's
a lot more.
awesome. Thank you, Megan. There seem to be a lot of different medications that treat one condition, like depression. How do you choose one over another?
Someone's been watching commercials.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Well, but really, I mean, the SSRI option, I mean, when I was studying
there
them, I couldn't remember them all. Like, there's a lot,
Yeah.
I'll let you.
No, you go.
Yeah. I send them to a psychiatrist.
We're referring in this moment.
Yeah. So I will keep this kind of general on purpose, but I will typically have an understanding of those medications that are available for this particular diagnosis that I'm looking at. And what I'll consider is the side effects of certain medications, the expected benefit of certain medications, and also the individual in front of me. What medical conditions do they have? What values do they have? Some medication cause weight gain. For some people, they're like, cool, great. For some people, they're like, absolutely not. So it's really important to understand, who is this person in front of me? What do they value? Like, again, why are we here and what are we trying to work on?
Yeah.
And so with these medications, which one is most likely to help you, and also one that you're willing to partner with. And, this is with any medicine in general. So this is not just psychiatry. Like, medications have side effects, right? And so when you're entering into that relationship with the provider, you're saying, here's the indication for this medicine. I acknowledge that I hope that the benefits outweigh the risks of taking this medication. And my provider has told me about the potential risks of taking this, the side effects of taking this. And my goal is to hope to get better. And I'm willing to take this in with that trust of I'm going to get better, or most likely to get better.
And you brought up something here, which is the the client or in your domain, the patient's role in this too, understanding what this is how this is going to affect her or him, and saying yes or no, because so not only does the psychiatrist choose, but also the patient, right? In that sense.
Right. I am not telling you to take this medication. I am making a recommendation.
And have you noticed that there's greater med adherence for those who, or do you know? I mean, what is your thinking on that? You know, when there's more of a partnership there with the patient and psychiatrist.
I would say that the therapeutic alliance is what we call that.
Oh,
but
yeah.
the stronger that therapeutic alliance is, the more likely that relationship and everything y'all have talked about and planned will kind of play out.
Okay.
And there's a lot of factors that go into that, you know.
Sure, of course.
But yeah.
Of course.
And part of them is educating on the process. You know, psychiatric medications are pretty hard to do research on. There was just a study recently that they're trying to test out antipsychotics on rats, but they can't tell when the rats are having hallucinations. And I was like, of course, like that makes it.
Word.
Yeah, you
that
can
does- I've
you
never
can tell
thought
when
about
they
that.
have eczema or what
Yeah, right,
whatever
right.
else, but like
Yeah.
they
Or when they're hyperactive or whatever.
But they were just like
Yeah.
psychiatric medications have come a long way, but there is some figuring out,
Yeah.
when it
Yeah.
comes to getting the right medications.
Yeah. It's complicated. I don't do that level of research, but like, what does depression look like in a rat?
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't.
I mean, I don't know.
Some
but
people would
like
think
some people know, and
it
they
just
have.
is a constant state if you're a rat.
I've been in this business and worked with people on a
I
lot
don't know,
of.
Ratatouille. They were pretty happy.
It just was kind of eye-opening about, why are these medications
Oh my
hard?
gosh, yeah, absolutely.
And like making strides in research.
So it is kind of a black box in some ways. I mean, you have to just do the best you can to look inside the brain of the rat or whatever. But
And that's not the only way, and it's not to say that there's not evidence for certain medications. So I do want to point
Oh,
that.
yes, I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry.
I
That's
don't
not-
want you to think that we're just kind of like.
We are evidence-based.
hallucinating rats.
Yeah.
No.
No, I was just talking about why are some, classes of medications very precise, and we've,
Sure,
we've figured this
yeah.
out, and
Yeah.
it is, but I think it is complicated. I
And
mean,
understanding the brain better, which will help too, I would guess. But and that's coming along, sometimes slowly, I guess. This person says, I have an ADD diagnosis. I guess they mean ADHD diagnosis. I received accommodations in college. Sometimes the I'm so ADD led to conversations where classmates also wanted accommodations, or they thought I was faking it because I did well in school. How do we move that dial? Is that part of the larger issue with stigma?
yeah, that's a great question, and I feel that's really frustrating that this person has had to sort of defend themselves.
Yeah.
I think that, really understanding and educating what is ADHD, how does it affect me, not that you want to be defending sort of on the defense all the time, explaining yourself, but yeah, I think they're, I think we have work to do.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, or fortunately, however you want to view it, when you're the one or when it's your family with the diagnosis, you get to help educate us, the rest of us,
True,
on it.
yeah.
Yeah, it probably most likely comes from a place of not really understanding what ADHD is, right? So someone might be like, kind of how we talked about, oh, it's my OCD. So some people are like, I'm ADD, and so they might be like, I get distracted sometimes,
Right.
but that's not what ADHD's like only is, and so
Yeah.
for this person who, with like, let's say, so ADHD is one of those things I was talking about where medications like significantly help people with ADHD. And so I just lost my train of thought. But
Fitting.
Oh, no.
Rats.
But if this person, let's say they're taking a medication, the medication's been so helpful for them. If this person wasn't taking that medication, their level of functioning may be like drastically different, but these other peers aren't necessarily seeing that. And so they're looking at this person, they're looking at the accommodations maybe, and they're saying, that's not fair, or I want that or something, and they're totally missing the bigger picture of
Right.
what this experience is for this person. So going back to general education on what are these diagnoses. And
Yeah.
And the truly not cynical side of me would also recommend for this person to recommend to their peers to go and get tested. If they really are struggling, I mean, this
Wow,
is,
yeah.
it sounds a little like, well, why don't you go see if you have, I mean, but no, but it's the sincere.
Yeah,
Maybe
that's-
you do
that's a
have
great
it,
point.
and maybe you
Absolutely.
do need to go and
Yeah.
get the help that you need.
Yes. Can anxiety, much like depression, cause you to lose interest in activities that once captured your attention? I think we hit on that just a little bit, but just the things that brought joy or hobbies or whatever, and you just don't.
Because I sort of conceptualize anxiety as a dreadful feeling, I don't know that it causes a lack of interest, because that's an actual like diagnostic criteria of depression, but it can cause you to cost benefit, weigh the problems with going and doing this, or taking on a new challenge or a hobby or something, and decide to opt out. So I don't know if it's the semantics are important, I would say. So if you lost interest, that's not necessarily anxiety. But if you've decided that it's not worth it anymore because of how you're feeling about
Like,
doing it.
Energy-wise even, or just?
No, more mentally, like not feeling like, oh, I can't go to that tonight because it's giving me too much of
Oh,
those dreadful feelings or those,
Okay.
somatic feelings that we talked about
Right.
to be able to
Or it's
do
going to
it.
remind me too much of this or that or the other.
Well, and
yeah.
social anxiety, I would think, would be a good, oh, I would love to go see this concert or go to this thing, but the things that are causing me anxiety are to the point where I can't go to that thing that I would
Yes.
really like to do anymore.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah, no matter how much you would really
yeah.
desire that, which could lead to greater depressive
Right,
sense
yeah.
there too,
So
absolutely.
indirectly, yeah.
Yeah,
can I say something as
Sure.
a tangent to therapy? So
of course.
about the medication question.
Yeah.
I want to point out that there's different types of therapy too. So sometimes I'll talk with someone and they're like, oh, no, I've tried therapy, it doesn't work for me. And I'm like, okay, well, what did you try? And
Great point, Blake.
and sometimes what they experienced might not be a great example of therapy. And so for different diagnoses or what someone's going through, there are different like specific types of therapy that are shown to be more effective.
Yes,
and
for
so,
particular diagnosis.
right.
Yeah.
And so I know that was a tangent, but I just want,
No, that
people to
can't be said
understand.
enough. That's
yeah.
Yeah.
absolutely. And also, different people respond differently to different kinds of therapies. They're
And different kinds of people.
and different kinds of people doing them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
if you feel like maybe I might benefit from therapy, but I had a really bad experience that one time,
Yeah.
my hope is that there's someone out there who you would connect much better with, who
Well,
could help you
That's
through that.
great.
And you mentioned the therapeutic alliance before. You're not going to build that with every single person in the world. That's just
Yeah,
impossible
right,
to be
right.
able to build that relationship. But there is somebody out there, like you said, that it is possible. But it does require some patience sometimes.
Really great.
And that's hard, yeah.
Absolutely. How's being a psychiatrist in a military setting different than in a civilian setting?
That is also a very big question. And some of my peers, they're like, they know so much about military psychiatry. I'm very early in my career. And to be honest, I am 2 years into my training, and not even all that training is military psychiatry. In general, from my experience so far, there is this concept of wearing multiple hats, and like under each hat, I have different responsibilities. And so with the military, a lot of times I find myself considering that person's occupation and the implications of prescribing a medication or certain diagnoses. Like certain diagnoses, may cause you to have to go through like a medical board process, and you might not be fit for like military service. And the concept of stigma within the military itself is a very, mental health stigma is a very unique thing, because not only is it the general stigma of society and things that people are bringing to it, but now that could affect my job and things like that.
Yeah.
And as psychiatrists within the military, our desire is to help this person through what they're going through, and our desire is not to rip your job away from you, right? But as a psychiatrist within the military, we do have to maintain the interests of the big military as a whole, and kind of who we work for and the rules and regulations in which we work, as well at the same time of this person, this individual in front of me, and considering all those things. So it just adds another dimension to it.
Yeah, that's a heavy task there, really, of a thing. One last question here, and that is, what are some recommendations and or tips to give to family members to encourage, love, support loved ones dealing with depression or anxiety disorders?
With any mental health problems, you're likely not going to talk the person out of them or at all help by minimizing them or by saying you really don't have it as bad as that guy does or your sister did or, whatever. We talked about the word alliance, and you just want to be in that person's corner.
You just made me think of something, not just a therapeutic alliance, but maybe a familial alliance or a friendship alliance too. I mean, that concept of therapeutic alliance maybe could be transferred to the non-therapy session.
It's and that's really hard when you are the person's parent.
That's right.
Even if they're adult children or
exactly
older adult children,
Sure.
I would say you're not going to do anyone any favors by minimizing or trying to talk someone out of something, or by trying to control them or their experience. That's really
hard,
going to,
especially in a family, if you're a parent and your child.
Right. It's very hard.
Yeah.
I would say get your own help also.
Right.
Yeah.
So I was just
Yeah,
going to say
thank
that.
you.
Sorry,
So,
Blake was going to say that.
No, I mean, thank you. But we were talking about this alliance. So really the alliance that we're talking about is just focusing on how do people interact with one another. Like how do I interact with you? How do you interact with me? What are all the influences there? And that's one of the fascinating things that I've just loved about my training, is just understanding myself better and how I interact. And so what I would say to a family member is, one, don't think for a second that you're unaffected by this. And some people might think, I have to be strong, I can't be affected, I have to, you are affected by this. Mental health can affect families in huge ways, whether they're seen or not. But also, I recommend this to most people, like you said, if it was possible, I think therapy for everyone to understand themselves better would be phenomenal.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of going back to that class and stuff, but as a family member, recognizing or having people speak into your life, if you're being affected by this, whether it's through therapy or just through interaction with others as well, and processing through some of these things, if you understand yourself better and what you're bringing to the relationship and bringing to the table, and how you're probably projecting that or tempted to project that into that relationship. If you have a better understanding of that and can control that a little more, that might be to your benefit. Because half the time when we're interacting with others, we're broadcasting things without realizing it.
Yeah.
And that's influencing how that person's perceiving what we're saying.
And sometimes that you can be broadcasting greater anxiety. It's like that person's anxiety level may go up when
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
he or she is around you.
And you're making them more anxious.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so not being an adversary, even when you're a well-meaning adversary,
Right, right.
and then getting help yourself, therapy and understanding yourself better and the strengths that you can bring to that. That's just great, y'all. Really great. Megan?
Oh, no,
anything
this is
there?
just, thank y'all for being here. I mean, yeah, this is.
Can we thank our
encouraging.
guests one
Yeah.
more time? This is just fantastic.
Yeah.
Again, this will be up at some point in the near future on at fbcsa.org/think. And thank you for your participation and for being here. There may be opportunity for some conversation afterwards, and I would recommend, or I would not recommend, but I would like to invite you to speak to one another about what brought you here, your own interest in mental health, whatever we can do to foster those kinds of conversations would be very, very good. And I know that some of you have very keen interests in these things, and so let's continue to build on that. Thank you for coming, everybody, and thank you, technical crew back there. Really, 100%, y'all. Really, thank you, and good night, everybody. See you.
We'll be back next week.
We
Yeah.
will be back next week.